Silently sit here.
That's smart.
Okay, hello everyone. Let's maybe get started. So you tell me, Sarah? Streaming? Okay. Welcome everyone. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford. Welcome for today's Friday lecture with Professor Alicia Holland. And thank you for those of you who are joining us through our YouTube live stream. Kindly note that the webinar is being live streamed and will continue to be available to the public after the event. Kindly submit any questions and comments through the YouTube chat, and I will make sure we convey those to Professor Holland during the Q&A session at the end of the talk. I do want to remind us all that we are, for those at Stanford, we are in the land and the territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We offer gratitude for the land, for the water, and the air that surrounds us, and pay our respects to the past, the present, and the future of the Ohlone and the Lenape peoples, who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout their diasporas. For those who are presently at Harvard and its neighboring areas, Harvard University is located in the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respects to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. Alicia Holland is Associate Professor of Government in the Government Department at Harvard University. Before joining Harvard, Alicia was an Assistant Professor of in the Politics Department at Princeton University, and she also was a Junior Fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. She is one of the most prominent stars, I would say, in our comparative politics discipline, where she studies comparative political economy of development with a focus on law, urban politics, social policy, immigration, and Latin America. Her book, Forbearance as Redistribution, The Politics of Informal Welfare in Latin America, looks specifically at the politics of enforcement against property law violations by the poor, such as squatting, street vending, and electricity theft. Her articles have appeared in all the major journals in our discipline. I won't list them right now. And today she's going to be talking to us about her new project, her new book project on the rise and fall of mass infrastructure in Latin America. Alicia, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's so fun to be here in person and also to have people online. And it's also a great moment because I'm sort of in the middle of this book project, so I'm very excited to get feedback on the project and share a bit of it with you. So I started thinking about this topic when visiting some relatives in Panama City. And I was there around Christmas time. I'm from the East Coast, so I thought, how wonderful. I'm going to go outside, and what I like to do is rollerblade. So I asked my aunt, is there anywhere to go rollerblading around here? And she said, well, you can go on the highway. And I thought this was maybe just like a Latin American misunderstanding of exercise. It's not very well liked in my family. But she said, no, there's no traffic on the new Cinta Costera that they built across the Bay of Panama. And so I went rollerblading on this huge highway and started thinking about this question of why politicians invest in these large projects. Because one of the interesting things about the highway in Panama is that it was started under President Ricardo Martinelli, but didn't actually finish until his successor came to power. And more generally, this was a period when Panama and many other Latin American countries were investing in large infrastructure projects that usually take years, if not decades, to complete. And so the question that sort of puzzles me is, why do politicians build these projects that aren't going to be done during their time in office? They're not going to be able to cut the ribbon and inaugurate them. And coming from the US, this was also particularly puzzling because we usually have this story of declining investment in infrastructure. So if you look at statistics on public spending on infrastructure as a share of GDP, for advanced industrial economies like the US and Europe, what you see is a steady decline since about the 1960s. But the story in developing economies in Latin America specifically is really one of a lot of investment in the last 20 years, basically. And so I started thinking about this question of why are we seeing these investments in infrastructure? And what I want to argue today is that to understand this question, we really need to think about the contracting politics behind these projects. So a lot of social scientists think politicians want to open these projects, maybe they want to create construction jobs on these projects, or they're just, far-sighted, thinking about the welfare of people who are going to use these projects. But behind these projects is usually a very lucrative construction and financial contract. And I saw this in Panama City as well, that when you get to the end of this lovely rollerblading path / highway, you come to a monument for Odebrecht. And so for those of you who've followed the scandal around Odebrecht, much of this is going to become obvious in terms of the ways in which a large Brazilian construction company and many other construction companies were making payments to push these projects forward and also really reshaping political campaigns in the region. So this book really makes 3 arguments that I'm just going to give you a flavor of today. So the first is this idea that the benefits for politicians really come from assigning these contracts, often in exchange for campaign donations. Second, we might think, well, politicians benefit from these projects, but there's still a cost. You still have to raise money and taxes to fund infrastructure projects. So if you think about the failure to build infrastructure in the U.S., it's usually explained that it's hard to raise taxes and get a consensus around funding projects. But one of the big things that's changed over the past 20 years is that contracts also can be designed in ways that push the costs off budget and on to future administrations. And that's really reduced the political costs of pursuing these projects. And last, there is a lot of variation in countries that are pursuing infrastructure. So you can think of big spenders like Panama and Ecuador and Peru, but there are many other countries that really don't follow this infrastructure boom. And I'm going to argue that institutions do matter in terms of shaping political decisions to invest in infrastructure, but there are a set of institutions that we often don't study. I'm going to call these inhibitory institutions, but they're basically bureaucracies and rules that shape investment before it happens. So these are things like planning agencies, cost-benefit units within finance ministries, and also comptrollers and inspector generals. So they're different from often what we study as horizontal accountability institutions that can hold politicians responsible after something has happened. And the main takeaway really is that infrastructure can be really compatible with democracy in the region. It's key to getting the campaign funds to do a lot of the vote buying activity that gets studied in Latin America. But at the same point, these projects have no guarantee that they're going to improve social welfare or increase economic growth, in part because they're often selected with private and political interests in mind rather than public welfare. Now, the book itself, and I won't be able to talk about all of this today, uses a very broad range of evidence. The backbone of the book, though, really are case studies of 3 Andean countries, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And obviously it's hard to study campaign finance, especially in a region that doesn't really publish much data on how campaigns are being financed. And so I look for a couple of different types of evidence for the first part of my argument. The first is that there are really distinct electoral cycles around the signing of contracts for infrastructure projects. So what you see is a lot of politicians sign these contracts when they're on the campaign trail. That makes no sense if the goal is to actually open an infrastructure project while you're in office. But it makes a lot of sense if you're trying to raise money for a campaign through quid pro quo negotiations. I also use public opinion surveys and some embedded experiments, as well as scraping Twitter data, to understand how politicians claim credit for these projects. And what you see is that politicians are even more likely to announce signing the contracts for these projects than they are opening projects. And this shows that, it's not that signing a contract is a negative electoral signal or has a political cost, but actually politicians are still trying to really claim credit for this early stage of building these projects. And a lot of the evidence for the book also comes from the Lava Jato or car wash scandal. So this is a scandal that starts around a money laundering scheme in Brazil, but comes to encompass politicians and ministers across the region. And I treat this as sort of an external shock to the Andean countries that I study, where we learn a tremendous amount of information that wouldn't otherwise have been revealed about who was bribed and how these processes were working. And then I do case studies of large projects. I'm going to focus on a subway, energy, and highway project in each country. Today I'll talk about the highway projects just to give you a flavor for the empirical evidence. And around each project I did sort of process tracing to understand both the origins of the project and then also the politics around improving and changing its quality. And then lastly, one part that I won't talk about today is I use some natural experiments to try to tease out what's the actual role of these institutions versus kind of broader political forces and explaining the trajectory of these projects. So to jump in today, where I want to start is with a question that sort of bedeviled the American Congress as well, which is what is infrastructure? What are we even talking about? And I think one of the interesting things is that as I started this book project is that infrastructure is actually a really new term or really new comparative term. So it starts to take off in the 1960s. Before then, most people talked about public works. And part of this is that infrastructure really gains prominence along with neoliberal political movements of the late 20th century. And part of that is an attempt to separate out productive government investment from what's seen as wasteful spending. And a lot of the debates you see around infrastructure today have this flavor as well. So like in the US Congress, debating whether childcare is infrastructure often is a debate about whether it's productive and essential for the economy. Now the problem with that sort of definition that infrastructure is productive investment is it assumes these projects are productive. But in some ways, that's the big question behind this book, is when is infrastructure a productive investment? There are tons of white elephant projects that don't do anything for social welfare. So the way I define infrastructure is a much more traditional definition, which is to say that infrastructure or public works are physically situated investments. And they're investments in which the average cost, and sorry for the economics jargon, but what I mean here is just the cost that includes the capital or construction cost of the project, exceeds the marginal cost, or what you can actually recover through user fees and fares. So just to break this down, these are territorially rooted projects. You have to build something. And that creates, or we think it creates, a distinct spatial politics around them in which there are some areas that are going to benefit more than others. So a highway can be accessed by some people but not others. On the other hand, these are expensive projects, so there's a cost to building them. We think that cost usually comes up front, and then because you have to build the public work, and then it delivers benefits over time that can be recovered somewhat by charging fees and fares, but not entirely. In most cases, things like subways and highways aren't fully able to cover that construction cost. Now, this turn to infrastructure also came along with big changes in how infrastructure is done. And I think that we think a lot about privatization and the debates around privatization, especially in the 90s. But what that really meant was we were thinking about infrastructure that already existed and then was being turned over to private ownership. What happens in the 90s as well is that there are changes in how governments start to provide new public works or new infrastructure projects. And I want to walk through this today because it really starts to change the political logic of these projects. So the old model of public works was basically the state was going to oversee and provide public investment. And what that meant more specifically is that they were actually going to design the project. So there would be engineers, usually in a Ministry of Public Works, like Alberto's father, potentially, who would be setting out the specifications of here's where we want the highway, here are the materials we need, and then the state would still contract to the private sector to get the inputs for the project, but it would figure out what it wanted to do. And many firms might be contracted in this process, and this is what's often called an unbundled contract. So I'm going to hire a company to do the engineering, I'm going to hire somebody to provide me the cement, and then somebody else to provide the iron for the project. And usually our vision of these types of projects is there were big fights within the legislature about where to put these projects, what was going to be built, and sort of pork fights of I want this project in my district and not this other district. The problem with this model was usually that the maintenance costs of these projects were hidden. So everybody loved to build little projects in their district. Nobody wanted to pave them and maintain them in the long run. And we often think that here, politicians really were hoping to open the project in their district and cut the ribbon. The constraint came from the fact that if you were designing and hiring all of these people in little contracts, usually you needed to finance these on budget in some way, so through debt or taxes. And so that could be your constraint on providing infrastructure. In the 90s, what starts to happen is many governments look to public-private partnerships. And this is a change not only in how these projects are financed, but also the kind of timing of when and how they're built. So here the state really is just directing the investment process. And what that means is the state might come up with a very vague idea that it wants to do. So I want a highway from, LA to San Francisco. And that's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to hire a private firm to design the project, come up with a plan to build the project, raise the capital for the project. And this is what's called a bundled contract. So we're putting all of those things together. And in some ways this was very attractive because the idea was that you also put the maintenance and operation of the project into that contract. So you would solve this issue of politicians opening things that they never maintained. Now the problem, as you can see, is this becomes a very large, very lucrative contract. It also often changes the site of policy making. So these are contracts that are usually negotiated by a finance ministry because they're going to involve actually a private company providing the initial capital to fund the project. So legislatures get cut out of this process. Also, the investment costs are usually quite hidden. So the way these contracts are structured is basically a private firm is going to provide the initial capital to build the project, and then they'll get repaid over time through fees and fares and also usually pretty large government subsidies. These also are usually thought of as risk-sharing agreements where basically the state's only going to pay, let's say, if demand isn't as high as was thought. So, nobody takes the subway, the government owes money. But those costs are often really hard to track down and they aren't considered debt. So they aren't going to be counted until they happen, basically. So nothing is showing up on the budget while politicians are in office. So this creates a strong incentive for politicians to announce when they sign these contracts. And also, as I said, these are large, lucrative contracts given everything's bundled together. And yet the costs of these projects aren't showing up for years. So this is why I argue in the book that infrastructure really becomes about this exchange of contracts for either personal kickbacks and also campaign finance. So we still have visions of, politicians cutting the ribbon and opening projects, but in a lot of cases what they're doing is simply announcing that contract being signed. And again, the key point is that with infrastructure, we get a total change in the political logic. And I'm sorry this is a kind of ugly figure, but what I want to emphasize is that there are really two shifts that happen with this model of building infrastructure. The first is that you shift who's in charge. From the legislature that maybe had incentives to fight over the siting of these projects to the executive, or in Latin America, usually a very powerful president. And so when you've moved away from the legislature, you no longer are in these kind of territorial fights and you have a weaker geographic cleavage. On the other hand, you also have a shift in the timing of the costs. So we used to think that the problem was there was an upfront cost in which taxes needed to be raised. And so you had, a lot of tiny projects going to different districts, but not much money spent because no one wanted to raise taxes. And instead, what you have with PPPs or these public-private partnerships is deferred costs. And so that weakens the sort of partisan or party politics around funding these projects. And I call this, what we arrive at, as a sort of infrastructure choice problem, where suddenly politicians have a lot of incentive to spend on these projects, but they don't really have any incentive to choose projects that are in the public's interest. Their incentives are usually aligned with the contractors. Who has a project that can be done quickly, that I can sign quickly, or here's a very general idea for a project that, I thought of in my sleep. Now let's see if I can find a private company that wants to pay for it. So, in that environment, a different set of institutions become important to understanding what gets built in Latin America. I broadly call these inhibitory institutions. And I just want to go through this briefly because this is probably a little in the weeds of political science, but these are a different set of institutions in a couple of ways. So on the one hand, they look like what we might think of as regulators. So they are basically looking at the quality of government projects. Now the difference is that their eyes are on the government, not the market. So a typical regulator, like if we think of the FDA trying to see whether a new drug is safe, they're really focused on a market actor that's developed the drug. Here you have regulators who are looking at government projects saying, is this a good project? Does it have a social return? Now they do this before any spending occurs. So that's different than we often study horizontal accountability institutions like public prosecutors or even comptrollers, some cases, that are trying to hold politicians responsible or government officials responsible if they engage in malfeasance. But that hasn't happened after it occurs. Here I'm interested in authorities that are essentially looking at public actions before they occur, saying, is this a good idea or not? And then in terms of the scope of their authority, sometimes these institutions have the ability to veto a project and say, you can't do that, that's a terrible idea. But a lot of times they actually have more subtle power. So sometimes these institutions can gatekeep, which is that they can say, for example, the president can only sign contracts for projects that have positive social returns or pass a cost-benefit analysis. If it hasn't passed cost-benefit analysis, then don't even debate it. So that's gatekeeping in terms of shaping the public agenda. And I should say that model actually develops in Pinochet's Chile and then spreads across Latin America. The other thing they can do is just delay or obstruct projects. So a very common thing in infrastructure is to just say, I need one more study. I need another risk analysis. I need you to consult the communities. I need you to give me more detailed engineering studies. And what that does is it delays and delays when a contract can be issued to the point that it might not be in a politician's interest. To be concrete, what these institutions usually look like in Latin America are planning institutions that are really looking at, do projects make sense in terms of a national plan? Sometimes they're finance, like public investment agencies within the finance ministry. And then there are also this kind of large apparatus of Contraloría, Procuraduría, comptrollers, inspector generals that are the control apparatus of the state. And of course, because we're in Latin America, the big question is, do these institutions do anything? Are the rules actually enforced? Mm-hmm. And you see three really different pathways play out. So one is that, politicians just bypass these rules. They exist on paper. And in that case, what I expect to happen is you get a lot of infrastructure spending, but really with no quality control. And so you'll often see projects that are poorly selected and have major cost overruns. A second, ideal case is the rules actually matter and they bind politicians. There you see kind of the opposite outcome, which is often politicians aren't particularly interested in infrastructure. They can't capture many rents or campaign finance from these projects. But when projects happen, they tend to be higher quality. And the last is a pathway that I kind of think of as capture or expert capture, which is that politicians don't totally ignore the rules, but they're very adept at using experts and consultants to essentially use the rules to their advantage. So I'll show you that Odebrecht was a master at this, of basically hiring consultants that could produce studies that made it look like these projects were in the public interest. And usually here you also see high levels of expenditures, but with real problems of project selection. And the result is what I call a kind of quantity-quality trade-off, in which institutions often reduce infrastructure spending, but they improve their quality. So let me make this a little bit more concrete now. So as I said, I'm working largely in the Andean region, and my three main cases vary in the institutional context. So on the one hand, I study Colombia, which is pretty well known for a very powerful planning ministry. So Colombia is one of the few Latin American countries that doesn't actually gut its planning industry during neoliberal state reforms. And at the same point, they also have a very important kind of control and finance apparatus that looks at public contracting prior to its occurrence. In contrast, Peru is a case of really porous institutions. So Peru engages in really heavy state and market reforms in the 1990s that basically leave the state itself with very little in-house capacity. It's very heavily reliant on outside experts. And in Ecuador, what you see is a similar path to Peru in the 1990s, but then also populist attacks on these institutions under President Correa. So three kind of different institutional structures in these cases. And then across the cases, I look at three large-scale projects and then do a kind of larger statistical analysis within each country. I picked cases or infrastructure projects that differ by sector. There are a lot of books that look specifically at one type of infrastructure, like water. And of course, water and each type of infrastructure has these really important specificities. But my argument is that these contractual incentives actually extend across a variety of projects. So you can look at something like a highway, which is a line project that goes across different districts. You can look at an energy project that actually sometimes is called a public bad, like it's harming local communities to produce national benefits. And then you can look at something like a subway that's a really consumer-facing, not a business-facing project. And all of these large projects have a similar financial incentive for politicians and political incentive, despite very different territorial logics. Now today what I want to talk about is just the highway projects to give you a sample of this book. And again, the three cases have really different institutional, inhibitory institutions that I'm going to argue shape the outcome. So unsurprisingly, Ecuador under Correa does massive infrastructure spending, highly variable quality. Colombia has many more binding inhibitory rules, and that means that it's very slow and does much less infrastructure spending, but it's quite high quality relative to the region at least. And then Peru is a case where you really see this capture by experts that leads to high levels of spending, but really big problems in terms of what's selected to be built. All right, so let's start with Ecuador, which in many ways isn't a surprising case if you know Ecuadorian politics. But basically in the 1990s, Ecuador during the kind of, after the debt crisis, really tries to put in a lot of controls on public expenditures. Now some of these come from the comptroller that has to sign off on every public contract. And then the government also institutes cost-benefit analysis within the finance ministry. And again, this is kind of a shift from the ISI kind of macroeconomic planning model. And if you talk to, authorities involved in the 1990s, they'll say stuff like, we didn't believe in leftist planning, but we were very demanding that government investments have social returns. So there's a real attempt to sort of discipline expenditures by looking at the costs and the benefits of these projects. Now in 2008, Correa says, forget all that stuff. and he declares the entire transportation sector in emergency. Now, what that emergency decree allows him to do are three things. First, he can contract directly. So he basically literally calls up, every major construction firm in Ecuador and says, what project would you like to build? I want to build stuff. Second, he basically is able to do this off budget, not because of the PPP contracts that I talked about, but initially in this early period, the emergency lets him use Ecuador's stabilization fund, which was basically meant for emergency cases where oil prices dropped. So he spends the entire $1 billion of the stabilization fund. And then it also allows him to shorten and eliminate institutional review. And so basically the comptroller can't look at these projects. They don't have to pass cost-benefit analysis. He can be prosecuted ex post if something goes wrong. And so he proposes about $1 billion in new investment on highways. 38 of these projects have major cost overruns, which are double the initial budgets. And this is also a really key part of how Correa consolidates his power. So he starts these highway projects at a point that he doesn't have a single representative in Congress, and he's trying to basically take control of Congress to rewrite the Constitution. So Correa, through my interviews with construction companies, basically tells all of them 20% of the contract cost needs to go to the congressional campaign. And that's how he funds the campaign, wins 3/4 control in Congress, and Ecuador rewrites its constitution and really consolidates Correa as the key authority for the next decade. So that's a case where institutional bypass leads to these massive expenditures and real problems in terms of their quality. Colombia is a very different story. So as I said, it has this legacy planning institution as well as a powerful finance ministry that insists that any PPP contract has to be done through a single contract model, and any deviations have to be justified. So this closes off political discretion in how you write these contracts. It also requires that any project has complete studies, which take quite a while to produce. Now, this is frustrating to politicians. So in 2011, President Juan Manuel Santos proposed 47 projects, a huge amount of investment, $26 billion. And the business community in particular is very vocal in saying that all of these inhibitory controls are crazy. So they asked to remove the Minister of Transportation. They say in the press, there's excessive caution in signing these contracts. And Santos really wanted to tender these contracts before his re-election campaign in 2014. But the finance minister refused. And so here's from an interview. He says, these steps can take months. And you can imagine the pressure from the president screaming, when is finance going to decide? You should do it now. You have this project on hold. But that's the point. We can take our foot off the accelerator when politicians want to do crazy things that aren't in the interest of the country. And so there's this very subtle bureaucratic dance going on where they don't actually confront Santos. They simply take their time. So it takes a long time to do the risk calculations. We don't have the data on the land you need for these projects. And so basically they wait until after the election campaign. Now these projects are tendered. It's largely seen as the best set of projects in the region. Odebrecht withdraws from these projects, doesn't win a single one. And the finance ministry also decides only to fund one wave of this investment, not Santos' initial package. And largely these projects are seen as having produced really high quality projects. And again, a lot of this is through a much more subtle set of bureaucratic calculations that often look like what we think of as mere formalisms in Latin American politics. But when you talk to people, especially in the finance ministry, they're very clear that they're shaping the agenda. So here's another flavor of that. This is the director of macroeconomic policy who says finance is very powerful because if the calculations aren't good, then projects aren't viable. So here they're gatekeeping. You can't actually pass a project if finance hasn't approved the cost benefits. In public, finance supposedly only approves projects, but in private, there's endogeneity. We make the calculations that determine what can be proposed. All right, and now let me talk about just briefly a last pathway, which is Peru, that also creates this kind of public investment cost benefit analysis group in the 2000s after Fujimori falls from power. And this is really an institution that's born pretty weak in the wake of a corruption scandal. And the first clash comes with President Toledo when he's trying to build the IRSA South, which is a project to integrate Peru with Brazil. And the Ministry of Transport basically contracts studies, these are feasibility studies to see whether the project can be done, from a consulting firm called Alpha Consults. And we now know that Alpha was Odebrecht's favorite consulting firm that basically would produce whatever study it wanted. So this study claims that the highway would produce $500 million in benefits, largely for poor southern Peruvians. And in contrast, the public investment agency, SNEEP, calculates losses of around $300 million from the project. Now the key part about this is it becomes a very technical debate that other politicians as well as societal groups really can't enter. So here's a good example from the director of the investment agency in Peru who said, what was the support of SNEEP? This is a public investment agency. 10 PowerPoint slides. What was there on the other side? An engineering study with decades of experience and the Minister of Transportation approving it. So it sort of looks like everything is in line. This is a reasonable project. Now Toledo really wants to sign his contract before he leaves office, so he exempts the project from SNEEP, the oversight agency, and he gives the comptroller a week to look at this 1,000-page contract. So Odebrecht wins the largest stretch. We now know that it promised about $35 million in bribes to Toledo to build this project. But the Ministry of Finance does include in the contract a clause that says if the costs go above 10% of the budget, the contract is void. So when that happens, Congress needs to approve another payment for the project. And the Finance Ministry pushes very hard to stop the project. But instead, Odebrecht again contracts a study to show the immense benefits of this highway from prominent academics. And then Congress uses this study to authorize an additional payment. Now what's interesting is from Odebrecht's record, it never pays off Congress, but by producing this study, it's able to shift the public debate to justify additional expenditures. And this is a common story that I think is well captured by this quote by someone from the main investment agency of Peru who says, it's like you went to buy a Honda and came back with a BMW. So the story of Peruvian investment is there's a lot of spending, but the country is essentially picking projects that are in Spanish you'd say sobredimensionado, or they're too big. And they're well done, the engineering is good, Odebrecht has a good reputation for building, but they're the wrong projects for the country. So only 10 trucks pass on this highway each day in its first years of operation. So it really doesn't have any impact on social welfare. So just to wrap up and leave us some time for questions, what I'm trying to do in this book is really focus in on how politicians use the contracts behind these large infrastructure projects. And they both bring immediate political benefits, and they're also attractive because they allow politicians to push costs into the future, onto future administrations, and also reduce the control of Congress over these expenditures. And what that means is when these negotiations are fully within the executive branch, the types of institutions that can push back and question these projects also become quite different from what we used to study. They're things like public investment agencies and planning institutions. And some broader messages of this project, first of all, is that the rise of infrastructure is really important to understand how campaigns work in Latin America. And I would also say in the shift from an old model of patronage, where jobs were the key currency of politics, to one where cash is really critical to buy votes. And that cash is usually coming from these contracts. Second, I didn't get to talk about it much today, but I think this also has implications for how we think about issues of state capacity and the provision of infrastructure. The typical argument is strong states are those that have bureaucracies that can actually succeed in investing in infrastructure projects. But strong bureaucracies also can restrain politicians. And so actually some of the strongest cases in the regions, things like Costa Rica, Uruguay, or to a certain extent Colombia, they don't build these projects because you have bureaucrats who are overseeing the contracting and preventing the pursuit of projects that don't serve the public interest. Third, I think it has messages about the action of institutions, and really the sense that institutions can act in subtle ways. So we're often looking for vetoes and sort of formal conflict that's playing out in newspapers. But sometimes skilled bureaucrats can actually change the public agenda through their power of delay. And we often interpret delay as state weakness, like, oh, these institutions can't do their job, they need more studies. But I think bureaucrats actually have a sort of more cunning set of strategies behind them in some cases, in which they're using those delays to frustrate politicians who want to get these projects done. And lastly, I think one of the things that has come out of this research is really corruption happened in two very different ways in these cases. So under left-wing populists, you have a story where politicians attacked institutions, they treated them as these excessive technocratic constraints, and that allowed corruption to flourish in the infrastructure sector. But on the other hand, you also have these cases of right-wing, seemingly technocratic governments, like the case of Peru or Panama, where really what happened was a capture through the use of experts and through the use of consultants in these sort of hollowed out states. So that explains how we can get corruption and high levels of investment in infrastructure under such different ideological politicians. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you again for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, so we open up now to questions. I do have a question for you, if I can open up, and then we will go around the room. But what about the promise of democracy with all these checks and balances? I mean, weren't we expecting that the judiciary, the legislatures, were going to be all these great mechanisms to control corruption? I mean, it sounds, even the last slide, I mean, as though you put a lot of faith in the end on these bureaucracies of all places in this era of democratization. So I was wondering whether you can tell us a little bit more about your thinking there.
Sure. So part of this is an empirical realization. So one of the things that I did was code all of the judicial investigations that were revealed through the car wash scandal, as well as those that national prosecutors pursued. And what's amazing is almost none of these cases involve bribes to Congress. So outside of Brazil, and this is, Brazil is a little bit unique in this sense, almost all the bribes are to ministers of transportation, regulatory authorities, comptrollers, and also, a lot of payments to consultants get revealed, basically. And so that sort of anatomy of how construction worked really changed my perspective on what legislatures were doing, which is, that's what pushed me down the path of, why aren't they involved in these decisions? And also this territorial question of, how you actually get agreement to build, these giant highways in one region of the country. Like, why isn't the north of Peru objecting to the highway that's benefiting the south? And I think what showed up is that this really is a case where legislatures were weakened because the transition to democracy happened at the same time as, austerity measures, where a big interpretation of the kind of profligate spending of past periods was that Congress was out of control. It was building pork projects. And so if you sort of reduce the role of Congress over these projects, you could also improve fiscal discipline. And so that cuts Congress out a lot of budgetary processes. And then these public-private investment contracts also really shift power. And, the IMF and World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank loved that shift at first because finance ministries were seen as a sort of technocratic, high state capacity, ability to oversee these projects. But I don't think the political logic of what these contracts meant was fully apparent, or at least was enough to compensate for what were their perceived advantages.
Questions? Okay, let me go on this side and then we'll go around. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's amazing research that you're doing. I was wondering if you could speak about the case of Mexico with the Mayan thing that announced just a few years ago, and how your research kind of fits on on this case. into this case.
Yeah. So, I mean, Alberto was pushing me as well. Like, you have to include Mexico in Maya. Like, part of me said, yes, I probably do. I mean, so there are many different angles of that project. I mean, one of the things that interests me, and I'm debating how big of a part of the book it's going to be, is also what is the role of communities. And going back to the question about democracy, some of the institutions that have been created to empower communities in discussions of these projects. And so in some ways, that's what you see playing out is, communities really trying to question whether they've been consulted. What does it mean to consult communities? Is a popular referendum enough? Do you have to consult, indigenous groups more specifically? And I think those are some of the really interesting questions of how communities can also potentially also be a check on the quality of these projects, or at least question these projects. So I think that's one dimension that's quite interesting about that case. I think one of the interesting things there is that AMLO has been very skilled about playing different visions of the public off each other. So things like, using a national referendum to validate his decisions about, the Mexico City airport or many of his other decisions, to say like, well, the majority of the people are behind me in this. But then to use that to counter a much more local vision of who's impacted, such as indigenous communities along the route of the Tren Maya. And so you have these kind of two competing visions of the public that I think are fascinating in those cases. I'll just say more briefly though, some of my work in looking at sort of these prior consultation procedures, because like Colombia also has very strong rules for this. I also got a little bit depressed about the ability of communities themselves to really serve as a check on sort of the quality of these projects. And part of that is because infrastructure often opens up these much broader bargaining processes about what communities that are often excluded from development really deserve. And so oftentimes, like Colombia, what you see happening is the road is coming. That's our time to go and push for health clinics and schools. And it no longer becomes a discussion about the road, whether the government wants to build it or not, but instead about what additional goods should those communities get as part of the infrastructure process. And the state's position often is like, the road is enough, we're giving you a road. Where the community's position is, we didn't ask for a road, we asked for healthcare and schools, etc. So I think one of the fascinating things about infrastructure, and something AMLO realizes quite well, is that it plays these different scales off each other. And who in a democracy should decide and have input about these projects, I think is really complicated. So anyhow, that's just one angle of the Tren Maya, but yes, I should probably include AMLO and I'll talk to him. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hi, Jen. So you had an argument that said about, it's not about public goods, it's mostly about contracts. But even then, you're sort of saying how it could be perceived that like these infrastructure problems do sort of, at least on paper, serve the needs of the communities and the people of the countries. But what about, does your research would include like international forces? I know specifically every single 4 years of the Olympics or the World Cup always brings about massive infrastructure issues and protests saying that like a stadium it's really not like in our public interest, like it's outright in the forefront, but there's still this sort of idea it's about bribes, it's about the contracts and construction companies. So what's your sort of take on that situation?
Well, let me clarify one thing, which is even though I think a lot of the political motivation is about contracts, it's true that there's often, kind of broader political branding and interest in these projects. And I think the Olympics and the Inter-American Games are great examples of this, where it's also, these projects are associated with modernity. They bring attention to a city or a country. So they have these kind of prestige motivations that are also, important in the back of politicians' minds, or maybe front of politicians' minds. But I also think, those are great examples of, the stadiums and these large games where usually we find out later that there were pretty huge bribes around how these contracts are done and who's being chosen. And some of the same institutional dynamics, I think, play out and sort of figuring out, whether these projects are done in a more efficient or less efficient way. I think also a lot of the same, we saw this especially in Rio, questions around land and how you actually get the land to build these projects are very much behind those sorts of games and stadium type projects. I think what's more complicated actually is when you move outside of these sporting events or, real sort of international prestige projects is, there is an argument for these projects as key to economic growth. Sometimes they are critical for development. And that's why I think it's really hard for often voters to be at the center of these processes and at the center of evaluating these projects is you will have business chambers saying we need to reduce the cost of transport. It costs more to move, a crate across Colombia than it does to move the crate from the port in, in Cartagena to China. It's crazy. So there is an argument that Latin America needs infrastructure and that's critical to development and sometimes critical to social welfare too, which is why the reason yes, there's kind of contracting politics behind this, but the key thing is how do you get these contracts to still serve the public interest? And that's a little bit different than the stadium questions, perhaps, where there's not even this competing development logic that people are trying to evaluate.
Nati? I'm starting to get more hands. Yeah. Nati, you had your hand up.
Hi, I'm Nati. Thank you so much for your presentation. So I study infrastructure, and I'm really curious about planning infrastructure and transportation that accounts for women's safety in Mexico City specifically. And I was really interested in how you're talking about the whole bureaucratic process that goes into planning and realizing projects, and how there's a lot of inhibitory institutions. And so I was just wondering, for cases that are extremely urgent, like women's safety and public transit throughout all the biggest cities in Latin America, how does one go about planning or realizing a project in a reasonable amount of time when women are being assaulted and it's an urgent matter, but this process can take past people's terms in office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. In a certain sense, I told you about examples where politicians were abusing emergency orders, and I think we see a lot of that in Latin America. Most Peruvian infrastructure is built through an executive decree or an emergency order. And obviously there are some legitimate cases for using emergency orders, after natural disasters, and maybe you would say women's safety should fall into a similar category. On the other hand, I would say a lot of the questions aren't necessarily about new infrastructure in these cases. I think, there are many questions about sort of, ridership or the design of cars, where processes can move more quickly. And obviously there is a tension between moving fast on something and making sure that contracts and the sort of design principles are done well. And I would say that's a tension that extends also to the extent of participation you permit in the planning process. What I've told you is a pretty top-down, bureaucrats are designing projects, but obviously one of the questions is where's the public? Should you be opening up, issues of design to, feminist groups participating, providing input? Is there a consensus about what that should be? And, all of those processes take time that work against having some sort of urgent solution. I think the other thing that's complicated is we often sort of assume, the public has opinions over these projects before they're created. And I think one of the hard things is a lot of times, voters can't imagine what the solution is. So the government still has to do some preliminary work to say, here are the different ways you could improve women's safety and reduce assaults. Among them, what does the public think? Is this going to work? Is that, seem feasible? And a lot of times, I think that, in requirements for participation, the government forgets that prior step, which is you have to have effective participation. You need experts who have done enough of the work to then explain to people what legitimate or what reasonable choices are. And that's a long process, and so there is a tension, as I said, between quantity and quality, and in situations of urgency, there are mechanisms to go faster, but they also come with risks that things are not done properly.
Isabella?
Yeah. Hi, thank you for the amazing talk. My question was more on inhibitory institutions because I was thinking about like electoral rules, and Brazil is where I'm most familiar with. And for example, there you have like 2 term limits, but then you can wait 1 term and then run for office again. So kind of like in this logic of credit claiming, right? Because if you close a contract, you can claim credit for this big project that should improve infrastructure and etc. But then when the next incumbent is not able to like actually perform this project, you can actually claim credit again that it was the fault of the previous mayor who didn't invest and really like develop this amazing project that you and your party kind of like signed the contract for. So do you think that actually like those different electoral rules, they can work as inhibitory or like actually incentives for politicians to sign those contracts?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different things here. So one I would say, one of the complications of the credit claiming logic, like at first I thought, oh, there should be a clean prediction. Like if you can run for re-election, like you should see much more of this like end of term signing. I think especially if you're thinking about this on a national level, that gets complicated by the fact a lot of these politicians still have other ambitions. Like all the term limit has done is made them think like maybe I'll go run for governor now, or maybe I'll open my infrastructure consulting firm now, and so in that sense you can still see some of the same dynamics, I think, even when there's not direct re-election for the same office, which is a little tricky. The point about like credit claiming and what your predecessor has done, in part, those incentives depend on the contractual form. So like PPP contracts, the company actually has a strong incentive to finish the project. And that is one of the reasons economists love these contracts, is like you have to open the project to start collecting like fees and fares. And so like most companies do want to finish. What you see happening is tons of renegotiations. So oftentimes the tender for these projects is very competitive and transparent, not always, but sometimes. But then once you pick the contractor, they're basically in a bilateral monopoly relationship where they know the politician wants to, either extract more rents or finish the project, and they also can ask for better and better terms. And so what you see is, most PPP contracts are negotiated about 5 times, and that's because successors come to office and they say, I want to cut in this. I might not, in AMLO style, cancel the whole contract because it has a really important fiscal cost as well as sometimes a political cost. But I'm going to renegotiate it in a way that I get my cut too. So the type of contract does matter for whether you see projects just not being finished and abandoned by successors, or whether you see cases where they just get renegotiated on more favorable terms by the next politician.
Yeah, Tris, and then
so I love the research design. It's really amazing. It looks beautiful. It's great. It's just a question of speculation, but I would like some clarity. So one is, why do you think that in Brazil the money went to legislators, whereas in no other place, right? And since the Lava Jato scandal is so prominent, maybe in some part of the book, you will have, maybe in the conclusion or something, you will have to reflect about that. So that is one question. And the other is, Colombia, which seems fascinating. So the binding institutions, and if you, so could you speculate a little bit more on where they are coming from, versus the very porous institutions in Peru. So I find very convincing all the argument. Just a little bit more reflection on this.
Yeah, I think I've been struggling, do I have to peel things one layer back and explain like where these institutions come from? Because I think that is a great question. And I give a couple of answers about Colombia. So one, I think you could make an argument a little bit along the lines of like Ana Gris Malabuse and Rebuilding Leviathan, where like robust political opposition strengthens, commitments not to exploit the state. And you can kind of think of this in a similar framework. My mechanism is a little different in that what opposition might be doing is actually enforcing and empowering these bureaucratic actors. And you do see cases of that where I think especially in the 90s, when Colombia still has a little bit more of a coherent party system, you have cases where the opposing party says, you can't just, change planning, you can't go around, the Contraloría. And so that can be one mechanism of, robust political opposition enforcing these rules.
Absolutely.
I think the courts, to go back to your question, also matter. The Constitutional Court in Colombia has been very clear, like you cannot use emergency authority and executive orders to circumvent rules. And, where the Colombian Constitutional Court comes from, is like, quién sabe, but it is a functional institution, and you see that, especially Uribe, who tries to challenge these same rules, and basically he can't use emergency decrees, he can't circumvent the sort of fiscal authorities. And I think that a lot of that came from the court enforcing against him, just like they enforced on term limits. And so that's a case of complementary institutions being critical to then enforce these rules. But it's a good question. The other thing that I've thought about, and I'll just say one more word, is that business also is interesting. Colombia is a case that has, kind of 5 to 10 important domestic construction firms that also are owned by the largest productive families in the country. And they form an infrastructure chamber that, although they're pushing the projects to go fast, really is important, and also creating legislation that really gives finance control, requires these model contracts, wants to use PPPs. And that's very different than in Peru. There's basically a single construction company that is a subsidiary of Odebrecht. And so they have an infrastructure chamber that Odebrecht funds, but all of it is anti-institutional. Don't bother, do this by emergency decree. Build this highway, Odebrecht is interested. And so business also plays a very different role. I trace that back to the sort of structure of the industry and the sort of combination of business and construction interests in Colombia being quite different. But that's something I'd have to kind of think more broadly if it would apply elsewhere. And then Brazil, I probably need to include Brazil as a shadow case. I mean, I can't really answer why the legislature maintains a much more prominent role in Brazil. And I honestly think, even Barry Ames's old book on sort of public works, it's very in the spirit of American politics, where it's all pork trading to build coalitions in the legislature. And I just don't think that applies to most other cases, at least that I study. But why? I can't answer. Why is the Brazilian legislature still defending of budget fights? I mean, I guess what I would say is, maybe looking back, it just shocks me how little authority Congress has in the budget process in general.
Yes,
and I think in Brazil that's somewhat different.
Yes.
We still have a couple of questions in the room, but I'm going to have to stop the broadcasting part, but we can continue the conversation. So thank you so much. We've just listened to Alicia Holland talking about creative construction. We're so much looking forward to your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the wonderful